What does it look like when one of the world's most sophisticated economies quietly dismantles itself? Not through war, not through a single catastrophic event. Through a layered accumulation of policy decisions, each one defensible in isolation, each one compounding the last until the damage stops being cyclical and becomes structural. The United Kingdom, second largest economy in Europe. The country that industrialized the planet, codified international trade law, and built the institutions that still organize global finance. And yet, since 2008, British workers produce 20% less per hour than their American counterparts. The country has ranked at the bottom of the G7 for total investment in 24 of the last 30 years. Industrial electricity costs are the highest of any country, reporting to the International Energy Agency. Nearly 1 million young people between 16 and 24 are not in education, employment, or training. And the marginal tax rate for a doctor earning slightly over £100,000 is 62% higher than what a hedge fund manager earning 5 times as much pays on their marginal pound. If you follow structural economic analysis and want to understand the forces that shape markets before the headlines catch up, subscribe. This channel goes 3 layers deeper than the news cycle. I am not a financial advisor. Every number in this video comes from institutional sources, the Office for National Statistics, HMRC, the House of Commons Library, and the OBR cross-referenced throughout. That last figure is not rhetorical, and here is why that number matters more than almost anything else in this video. We will come back to it with the precise arithmetic. By the end of this video, you will understand 7 specific measurable policy failures, what caused each one, how they reinforce each other, and why the political path to reversal is narrower than most analysts acknowledge. This is not a partisan argument. These are documented mechanisms with documented consequences. Let me break it down. Before the mechanics, a brief historical frame because the starting point matters. For most of the 20th century, the United Kingdom ran a broadly functional model. Financial services in London, manufacturing across the Midlands and the North Sea energy revenue, and deep integration with European trade. That model worked well enough. The pivot away from heavy industry towards services through the 1980s looked at the time like successful adaptation to a changing global economy. Then 2 things converged. The 2008 financial crisis hit the United Kingdom disproportionately hard. London's concentration in global banking meant the shock was amplified well beyond what more diversified economies absorbed. And the policy response fiscal austerity from 2010 onward suppressed public investment precisely when private capital was already retreating. The combination did not produce a temporary dip. It produced a permanent reset to a lower growth trajectory. From 1970 to 2007, United Kingdom multi-factor productivity grew at 1.3% per year, according to Office for National Statistics data. Since 2008, that figure collapsed to 0.1%, a 13-fold slowdown, sustained for 17 years. Economists gave it the name the productivity puzzle. The data suggests it is better described as a policy outcome. That is the foundation. Here are the 7 layers built on top of it. The first layer is the investment deficit, and here is how it works technically. Labor productivity, the output a worker generates per hour, is directly tied to the productive capital behind that worker. Better equipment, more capable software, faster infrastructure. An economy that consistently underinvests in those assets creates a compounding gap with economies that do not. The United Kingdom's data on this is unambiguous. Whole economy investment stood at 19.3% of GDP in the second quarter of 2025, the second lowest in the G7, based on official national accounts data. For private business investment specifically, the UK has ranked last or near last in the G7 for 24 of the last 30 years, based on independent analysis of OECD figures. The last time the United Kingdom was average in the G7 for total investment was 1990. That number is worth absorbing. Consider what sustained underinvestment means across a generation. The United States, which has maintained investment rates approximately 6 to 8 percentage points above the United Kingdom's as a share of GDP, saw productivity grow at roughly 3 times the UK rate between 2010 and 2024. The Productivity Institute published analysis in May 2025 showing the United Kingdom has a substantial and growing capital gap relative to peer economies when measured as productive capital stock per hour. Worked. That gap was not created by a single policy. It was built through 30 years of chronic underinvestment in tools, software, machinery, and infrastructure. That means the following. The result is the 20% productivity gap relative to the United States. In other words, British workers collectively produce 1/5 less economic output per hour than American workers. Scaled across an economy, that is an enormous and compounding constraint on wages, public revenues, and living standards. That gap is not abstract. Consider what 1/5 less output per hour means compounded across an entire workforce for 30 years. And this is the mechanism that tends to surprise people most, so let me be precise about the arithmetic. In the United Kingdom, individuals earning between £100,000 and £125,140 face an effective marginal income tax rate of 62%. Not on their total income, on each additional pound earned within that specific band. That number deserves the arithmetic behind it. Here is how it works technically. Above £100,000 in adjusted net income, the personal tax allowance, the amount of income shielded from taxation, is withdrawn at a rate of £1 for every £2 earned. The standard 40% higher rate still applies to the income itself. But because a pound of previously tax-free allowance is now becoming taxable at 40%, the combined effect on that narrow band of income is 60% in income tax alone. Add the 2% national insurance contribution still applicable at that level, and the total marginal rate reaches 62%. A doctor earning £110,000 keeps 38 pence of every additional pound until the allowance is fully withdrawn. Above £125,000, the marginal rate drops back to 47%, meaning professionals in that middle band pay a higher marginal rate than the highest earners above them. Let that sit for a second. According to HMRC projections, more than 2 million people will fall into this 62% trap in the 2026-27 tax year, the highest number on record, driven partly by frozen thresholds and wage inflation doing its quiet work. Survey data covering over 1,000 professionals in that income band, published in 2025, found that nearly a third had deliberately reduced their working hours to stay below the threshold. More than a quarter had turned down a promotion or bonus. That is not tax planning at the margins. That is the tax code rewarding professional inactivity at the precise income level where productivity contributions are highest. The third layer is planning paralysis. The United Kingdom's planning system is, by most expert assessments, among the most restrictive in the developed world for major infrastructure. Planning applications for large-scale projects regularly take a decade or more. Legally empowered local opposition through appeals, public inquiries, and judicial reviews can block projects with no binding timeline for resolution. Foreign direct investment decisions route around the United Kingdom when regulatory timelines add 5 to 7 years of unrecoverable delay to projects that competitors can approve in 18 months. The OBR and multiple independent analyses have identified planning reform as one of the highest leverage available interventions for UK growth. The current government has signaled serious intent. Delivery remains the open question. Now let me pause on what we have established so far. So what have we established through 3 of the 7 layers? The United Kingdom chronically underinvests relative to every major peer, leaving workers with less productive capital each year that passes. The tax code contains a 62% trap that actively discourages high-skilled professionals from contributing more. And planning complexity blocks the infrastructure investment that would otherwise begin to close the first gap. These are not 3 separate problems. They are a system, each one reinforcing the others. 4 more to go. If this analysis is useful, subscribe and hit the bell. Most economic coverage addresses the headlines. This channel addresses the architecture behind them. Here is what the data shows, and it is more precise than most coverage acknowledges. The 4th layer is Brexit, and I want to be precise about the framing. This is not an argument about whether the decision was correct politically. That is a different conversation. This is about the measurable economic mechanics of what has occurred since January 2021, when the United Kingdom exited the European Single Market and Customs Union. Exit introduced non-tariff barriers that had not previously existed. Customs declarations, regulatory divergence, rules of origin requirements, phytosanitary checks, each one individually small, collectively adding friction to trade flows that had been frictionless for nearly 5 decades. The data from UK government sources is precise. Goods exports to the European Union in 2024 were 18% below their 2019 level in real terms, according to House of Commons Library Analysis of Office for National Statistics figures. Research published in December 2024, using firm-level customs data, estimated that Brexit reduced total UK goods exports by 6.4% and total goods imports by 3.1%. The impact was heavily concentrated in smaller businesses firms, with fewer than 40 employees saw European Union export values fall by 15 to 30%. while the largest firms largely maintained volumes by absorbing compliance costs that smaller firms could not bear. On business investment, the long-run OBR estimate, reconfirmed in recent forecasts, is that Brexit will reduce UK trade intensity by 15% relative to the counterfactual of remaining in the single market. That is not a political judgment. It is the United Kingdom's own independent fiscal forecaster. The labor market dimension matters separately. The flexible movement of European Union workers, seasonally responsive, sector-matched, filling healthcare rosters, hospitality staff, and agricultural harvest was replaced by a points-based system structurally oriented toward higher-skilled permanent migrants rather than the flexible, variable labor the economy operationally required. Structural nursing shortages in the National Health Service, chronic harvest labor deficits in agriculture, hospitality staffing gaps that compressed capacity, these are the documented outcomes of that substitution. Here's what the data shows. Brexit did not create the United Kingdom's underlying structural productivity problem, but it added friction to every mechanism that might have helped address it. Trade openness, business investment, and flexible labor supply at precisely the moment those mechanisms were most needed. The trade cost is measurable and ongoing. The long-run investment shortfall is documented in current official forecasts. Both figures are live. Before moving forward to the fifth layer, let me be clear about the compound effect. Each layer we have examined: investment deficit, tax distortion, planning paralysis, Brexit trade friction individually constrains growth. Together, they create a reinforcing cycle. The fifth layer shows what happens to the people caught inside that cycle. But here is the layer that tends to get the least analysis. The fifth layer is the NEET generation. In October to December 2025, 957,000 people aged 16 to 24 in the United Kingdom were not in education, employment, or training, nearly 1 in 8 of all young people in that age group, according to the Office for National Statistics. The rate has been trending upward since 2021. 3 in 5 of those NEET young people are economically inactive, not searching for work, not enrolled in study. The most commonly reported reason is health conditions. The proportion citing long-term illness as the cause of their NEET status is now the highest in the recorded series going back to 2000. Mental health conditions account for a significant share of that figure, but health is not the only driver. The economy is failing to produce sufficient entry-level professional roles that justify the investment of higher education at scale. The graduate wage premium, the additional lifetime earnings a university degree produces, has been declining as the economy concentrates in lower productivity services and public sector employment. When the roles that graduate education was supposed to lead to are not being created in sufficient numbers, young people make rational calculations about whether the pathway is worth following. Some exit the calculation entirely. The United Kingdom government launched an independent review of youth inactivity in November 2025. With findings expected in summer 2026. The focus is on mental health and disability barriers. That focus is appropriate and necessary, but it does not address the structural economic question at the root. What kind of economy consistently produces close to 1 million young people economically disconnected at any given point in time? The compound cost is not just human, it is fiscal. A young person who spends 2 or more years NEET reduces their expected lifetime tax contributions and increases their expected demand on welfare and health services. At close to 1 million people, that liability is embedded in the demographic outlook. If this structural analysis is useful to you, subscribe. The forces shaping the United Kingdom's economic trajectory are the same forces building in other advanced economies right now. And here is where the green transition story gets complicated. The sixth layer is the energy premium, and this is where the United Kingdom's green transition intersects with industrial competitiveness in a way that rarely receives honest analysis. The United Kingdom has, by most measures, made genuine progress on decarbonizing its electricity grid. Coal power was effectively eliminated by September 2024. Offshore wind capacity has expanded substantially. On carbon reduction metrics, the direction has been real. But the cost structure of that transition has been placed primarily on electricity bills through policy levies, network charges, and the carbon price support mechanism. The result is industrial electricity prices that are, by United Kingdom government data, the highest of any country, reporting to the International Energy Agency in 2024. UK industrial electricity prices were approximately double the IEA median for that year. Large industrial users pay 5 times more per kilowatt hour than counterparts in Finland. Compared to France, UK industrial electricity is 40% more expensive for large users in 2025, according to the government's own quarterly energy prices publication. The energy-intensive users group calculated that British industrial electricity prices are nearly 94% above the IEA median, even after taxes and levies are excluded. Consider what that cost structure means for manufacturing of the future. Battery production, semiconductor fabrication, electric arc furnaces, AI data centers, all electricity-intensive industries, all representing the sectors where advanced economies are competing for the next generation of industrial capacity. The United Kingdom's clean energy transition has been real. But loading its cost primarily onto electricity pricing has created an industrial competitiveness problem that the transition was theoretically supposed to solve. Manufacturing output data shows energy-intensive sectors fell by 1/3 from their 2021 level. The seventh layer is the generational wealth transfer. The United Kingdom's housing market and pension policy have, over the past 2 decades, produced a systematic and ongoing transfer of economic resources from younger to older cohorts. House prices have increased faster than wages in every major British metropolitan area since 2000, making ownership effectively inaccessible to a growing share of young workers without access to parental wealth transfers. The average age of a first-time buyer in London has risen to 35, and for those buying without parental financial support, the wait is typically longer still. The pension triple lock, the policy guaranteeing state pension increases by the highest of inflation, wage growth, or 2.5% annually, has protected pensioners' real income during a period of elevated inflation at a cost that falls disproportionately on working-age taxpayers and constrained public budgets. In years when inflation exceeded wage growth, the triple lock delivered real income gains to pensioners while workers absorbed real income declines. This is not an argument about whether pensioners deserve protection. It is a structural observation. When a large and politically powerful demographic cohort receives guaranteed real income growth, and a younger cohort faces housing costs absorbing 50 to 60% of after-tax income in major cities. The result is 2 separate economic realities coexisting inside the same national statistics. Aggregate consumption data tells one story. Household-level data for under 35s tells a different one. So where are we before moving to perspectives and implications? 7 measurable interconnected failures. Chronic underinvestment compounding the productive capital gap. A tax structure that actively discourages high-skilled professionals from working more, planning complexity, blocking the infrastructure that would address underinvestment. Brexit adding friction to trade, investment, and labor supply at the moment those mechanisms were most needed. Close to 1 million young people disconnected from economic life. Industrial electricity prices that systematically price advanced manufacturing out of the country. And a generational wealth transfer that creates fundamentally different economic experiences inside a single national headline figure. Each of these failures reinforces the others. They are not independent problems with independent solutions. Now let me give you the honest perspective from both sides of this debate. The bulls say the United Kingdom's fundamentals are more resilient than the headline numbers suggest. The City of London remains a global financial center with no realistic near-term competitor. Service exports, consulting, legal, financial, creative have actually grown since Brexit, up 19% in real terms to the European Union by 2024. The labor market remains tighter than historical averages. The IMF forecasts growth of 1.3% for 2026. The current government's infrastructure and planning reform agenda, if delivered, addresses several of the structural failures directly. And the United Kingdom has navigated structural transitions before it is not structurally incapable of adjustment. The bears say the structural failures are now self-reinforcing in ways that make reversal increasingly difficult. Investment deficits compound over time. The gap between UK and US productive capital widens every year without aggressive intervention. The tax code distortions are politically difficult to fix. Raising the personal allowance taper threshold reduces revenue at a moment of constrained fiscal space and rising public debt. Brexit trade frictions are now embedded in supply chain structures that businesses have adapted around, meaning recovery of lost trade share is not mechanical even if barriers were reduced. Demographic trends and aging population, a neat rate approaching multi-decade highs, are moving in the wrong direction and are slow to reverse. My take, probably both, in sequence. The United Kingdom is unlikely to face a sudden crisis. It has institutions, reserves, and genuine strengths that prevent a sharp break. What it faces instead is the slow, puncture, gradual, largely invisible erosion of productive capacity that creates the illusion of functionality while the underlying fundamentals move in the wrong direction. That is, in some ways, the more dangerous scenario. A crisis generates political urgency. A slow puncture does not. Low-risk scenario. The government delivers meaningful planning reform, business investment responds, and productivity growth recovers toward 1% annually by 2028. Possible, not the base case. Medium risk scenario, structural reforms are partial. The investment gap narrows but does not close. Productivity growth remains below peers. And the United Kingdom settles into a permanent lower growth equilibrium relative to the United States and Northern Europe. This is the trajectory most independent forecasters currently describe. High-risk scenario, a combination of fiscal pressure, demographic headwinds, and continued policy underdelivery produces a prolonged period in which real wages stagnate, public services deteriorate, and political instability makes structural reform progressively harder to execute. This is not the forecast, it is the tail risk. So what does this mean in practical terms? Now let me bring this to you directly. What do these dynamics mean for someone watching from inside or outside the UK? For investors, the United Kingdom has genuine assets, legal system, language, financial infrastructure, research universities, but the structural trajectory argues for being selective. Sectors exposed to domestic productivity and industrial competitiveness face persistent headwinds. Financial services and high-value knowledge exports face a different picture. For professionals in the United Kingdom earning between £90,000 and £130,000, the 62% trap is not abstract. The mathematically rational response, deliberately capping income or structuring compensation through pension contributions, is documented in survey data. Understanding the threshold mechanics matters for financial planning. For policymakers watching the United Kingdom from elsewhere, the most transferable lesson is sequencing. Austerity that cuts public investment while private capital is also retreating does not produce fiscal discipline. It produces a productivity hole that compounds for decades. The 2010 to 2015 period is the case study. The data on what it cost in long-term output is now well documented by the OBR, the IMF, and multiple independent research institutions. Here is what all of this, taken together, actually means. The United Kingdom did not fail suddenly. It accumulated failure slowly, through decisions that each had their own internal logic, but whose combined effect was a structural erosion that is now genuinely hard to reverse. The question for the next decade is whether the political system can sustain the long-horizon commitments on investment, on tax reform, on planning that structural problems require. Short political cycles and long structural problems are a difficult combination. If you want analysis that reaches these conclusions from primary data rather than political narrative, subscribe. That is what this channel does every time. The data is public. The mechanisms are documented. The outcomes are measurable. Whether the diagnosis leads to treatment is the open question. The United Kingdom is not a story about a country that lacked the capacity to solve its problems. It is a story about a political economy that found it easier to manage symptoms than to address causes. Whether that changes is the question that will determine not just British living standards, but how other advanced democracies interpret the same pressures they are already navigating themselves. The structural forces documented here, chronic underinvestment, distorted tax incentives, regulatory paralysis, and demographic imbalance, do not respect national borders. They are patterns, and patterns tend to repeat.